Welcome to our webinar, Envisioning Our Ideals, a holistic approach to quality in early childhood education. I'm Debbie Mathias from the BUILD Initiative and the Director of the Early Childhood Quality Improvement Systems Learning Network. Please respond in the chat box with some of your ideas to this initial question. You know, when this paper came across my email and later the second paper in the series, I found the approach and content very compelling. We're pleased to present this webinar and another webinar next week to explore the concepts and ideas of the authors. Today, we have colleagues registered from over 50 states and territories. When you registered, we asked what you hope to learn more about during the session, and many of you were curious about how to join the concepts of equity and quality in your work and the current thinking about quality early learning environments for children and families. We're interested in your questions, ideas, and thoughts throughout the session. So please enter into the chat box as something strikes you. If you have a resource or strategy to contribute from your work, please share. If you have a question, please use the Q&A tab. This helps us locate questions quickly during the session. I'd like to turn the session over to Ellen Roach, Executive Director of the Trust for Learning, to lay out some of the basic of the team's thinking, introduce our panel, and facilitate the discussion. Ellen?
Thank you so much, Debbie. It's really good to be here and so exciting to see so many folks who have joined the webinar. I'm Ellen Roche. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C. This is where I've spent the majority of my adult life and where I've been a teacher. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Trust for Learning, the organization that I work for, and then we'll give you a little bit of context on the principles of ideal learning environments, this evidence brief that we've just released in January. We've got another one, another webinar next week on another resource related to that. So we'll give you some context and then introduce you to our amazing panelists who have different sort of expertise related to this work, and really get into a conversation about this vision for quality that's deeply rooted in equity. So to kick off, I will just tell you a little bit about Trust for Learning. So we've been around for 10 years. We are a philanthropic partnership and we work nationally. Our mission is to expand what we call ideal learning environments for all children, birth through 8, in any kind of publicly funded setting. So very broad, big mission. And we take a racial equity approach and center children and families of color, kids and families who are facing poverty, multilingual children and families, and children with disabilities. And I'm really enjoying seeing folks responding in the chat about what an ideal learning environment looks like for you. You know, that could be an ideal learning environment that you've actually been to, maybe that you teach within or have taught within, or something that you imagine that you wish all children could have. So just to give you a little bit of history on Trust for Learning. So we've been around for 10 years. And as I mentioned, we are a philanthropic partnership, and we were founded by two moms, both of whom had small family foundations and both of whom had young children. And their kids were in a wonderful, privately funded, private pay Montessori program. And so I always imagine them, like at pickup chatting and just starting to talk about the things that would become the trust work. What they noticed was their own children had this rich, affirming Montessori experience where they were developing agency and developing, cognitive skills, social emotional skills in tandem. The environment was beautiful. They're developing friendships. And what they were being asked to fund as philanthropists often looked very different, where, programs that they might be asked to support as funders were much more academic, maybe not developmentally appropriate, more sort of drill and kill or worksheets, teachers who were not as well supported. And they started looking at that sort of difference in what their own children were able to experience through, a privately funded child child development program and what they were being asked to support as funders. So that gap in terms of what different families have access to is the sort of space in which the trust was born. And we really center our work around this question that we've all been chiming in the chat. And our vision, I think, looks very, very similar to what I'm seeing in the chat. But we really work to hold this vision, not just of quality, although of course we talk about quality as kind of a shorthand, but what are our ideals for young children, and really what are ideal learning environments for very young, developing people. So I'm going to share with you, we and our partners around the country have boiled this down into 9 key principles. They're not going to be new or revolutionary. They're not rocket science. They're going to feel like common sense, but they're based on these fundamental ideas. So really importantly, children we know are born actively learning. I often say, like, they can't help learning. They can't turn off learning. This is their default and natural state, right? Kids are seeking and questioning and exploring. It's how they pop out. So what does that mean in terms of the environments that we set up to support them? Another really important fundamental belief that human development is lifelong, right? All of us on this webinar are developing new neural connections, maybe at a slightly slower rate than kids that we work with, but adults are developing too, right? So how do we develop a system and classrooms and centers that support child development, but also support educators of all kinds, including parents? Really importantly, we know that people develop holistically. We've divided math from science, from English, from history in the older grades, for very good reasons. People go on to specialize, but we develop holistically. That's how human beings develop. So especially for young children, what does that mean in terms of how we set up a learning environment? And then finally, really importantly, that all kids have a right to early learning environments that support their own unique potential. So I want to give you a little bit more kind of info and intro about the principles themselves, and then I'll introduce our panelists. But just to give you a quick snapshot of the 9. So starting from the bottom left, the first and really foundational principle of ideal learning environments is a deep commitment to equity. And we take specifically a racial equity approach. So really starting from that perspective, and this is the sort of meat of our conversation today. How do we unite this sort of high quality vision of child development and best practice with a deep commitment to racial equity and other kinds of equity? So that's the first principle. I won't go through all of them, but we want to think about how children are actively constructing knowledge. The idea that play is how children learn, right? That we get out of this either or, oh, kids are playing or they're learning. We absolutely know that that is not the case, that play is a vehicle for learning. Some would argue the vehicle for learning. That teaching, instruction, children's experiences are really personalized. We know that this supports child development. Kids can reference their cultural knowledge, their linguistic knowledge, and they learn more and learn more deeply when they can connect to what they already know. What this means for the teacher is that the teacher is more of a guide, a facilitator, certainly very nurturing and co-constructing, scaffolding that skill development and knowledge development with children. And, I think about sort of the spectrum of how we think about teaching, and you've got, on the one hand, very, very didactic, maybe more drill and kill sort of instruction, direct instruction, sort of hyperbole over on the one side. And then you've got like children running in a field with no adult supervision on the other. And we know that neither of those is ideal for young children. And so what ideal learning programs try to do is work in this sweet spot where educators are very, very well trained, very well supported, very highly skilled, and that their role in the classroom is facilitating and responsive and supporting child development rather than, being the lecturer, especially for very young children. We know that children, really all of us, develop in relationships. So the relationship is an important part of the learning environment, all relationships. The physical learning environment is very intentionally designed to support exploration, curiosity. As I mentioned, we want to support continual adult development. And the final principle over on the right-hand bottom side, more philosophical, but the idea that the time of childhood itself is valued, that while we know that investments in very young children do have these long-term returns, and that's really important and very helpful in terms of, securing funding and making this a priority for our culture, that children themselves are living their childhoods right now, and that we should hold that time sacred and protect it and support children to experience their childhood. So it's not just about, how do we get to high school graduation rates? It's about who are we supporting, our youngest community members today. So I will just give you a quick snapshot of where these came from. So at the Trust, we think that this sort of framework for thinking about quality sits at this nexus of what expert educators know, what families want, families of all backgrounds, and what researchers have sort of highlighted as the essentials for child development. And I want to give you a snapshot of who the educators are that we work with. So the Ideal Learning Roundtable is a national group of experts, and I'm sure many of you know, folks from these different organizations. We have the privilege of working with these folks as really our brain trust. So they get together multiple times a year. They came up with the principles. They are our close colleagues in this work. So they're that kind of educator circle. And then in 2017, the Trust commissioned research really asking parents in their own words, what are you looking for in an early childhood program? And they didn't use the same language as the educators all the time, but the same core ideas came through, that parents want children to be capable, well-rounded, certainly ready for, school and cognitive development, but, to be joyful, to be prepared, to have those executive function skills going. And then the most recent of our publications, which is the impetus for this webinar, is this evidence brief that we've just released in January. I'm going to give you a quick preview of that by just sharing my other screen. So this is a digital resource, and what it does is it goes through each of the principles in depth and synthesizes a whole lot of developmental research. So this is neuroscience, implementation research, all kinds of research kind of bucketed together under these principles. So this was a labor of love to work on last year, but I think what's so exciting, and I just want to give you a preview, we'll share the link in the chat, is that, from my perspective, all of the researchers and all of the advocates are basically on the same page, right? The principles of ideal learning very, very closely in line with DAP. They very closely align with everything coming out of the Center on the Developing Child. They align very, very closely with all of these sort of visions of high quality practice. And our mission is, how do we bring this to life? How do we bring it to life in publicly funded settings, knowing that we're not always starting with, the ideal kind of environment for young children. So that's the work and the mission of the Trust, is to figure out, how do we do this? How do we do it in publicly funded settings? So yeah, that's all our kind of intro and context. And thanks again, Debbie, for having us.
Well, I'm excited to hear from the panelists. But before we do, Ellen, a lot of our participants today were curious about how this vision represents a merging of equity and quality. That was probably the question or idea that was most forward as people registered. Can you address that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I think we think a lot about sort of false dichotomies in the world of, early childhood. And I think that sort of play versus learning is one of those false dichotomies that we're all letting go of. And I think this is another one that we're all reckoning with, right? How do we take really wonderful visions of high quality practice and deep, very, very important visions of racial equity and other kinds of equity and bring them together? And I definitely do not have all the answers there. I know our panelists don't have all the answers, but they certainly have more than I do. And I'm sure that folks in the audience have perspective on this as well, because this is active, right? All of us are wrestling with this. And I think the way that we think about it is, it's kind of twofold. So one, the science, I think, is really, really clear on these core fundamentals of what children need to support development. And they can come to life in so many different ways, in so many different settings, in, of course, different languages, in different cultural contexts. And a good example of that is play, right? There's so much fascinating research on play. Should it be pretend play or, more realistic play or parallel play? All the play researchers and play, kind of nerds get really deep into those discussions. But the fundamental, universal takeaway is that we know that children are learning through play, and that this should be a foundation of a program, not the 20-minute thing that we let the kids outside to run around and do. So it's that evolution, I think, toward those universals, but in really different ways, it's all of our active work.
Thank you. Okay, now on to the panel, and I'll leave it to you to introduce our panel. Thank you.
Yeah, so I am so excited about our panelists, and thanks for letting me chat for a few minutes at the beginning, but I'm just going to get quiet and listen. And I am going to kick off and ask our panelists to each share from your perspective, what does an ideal learning environment look like? So I'll start. And of course, this is my job to think about and talk about ideal learning environments. But when I really sit and think about, okay, what does it look like to me? I think about observing children experiencing, within a day, within a particular class session, a range of experiences and being able to move through them, right? So seeing kids joyful as they're discovering something, seeing them deeply focused as they're working on something, seeing children get upset and move through it, seeing them sort of repair something that, has been challenging. So I think there's like a fluidity within an ideal learning environment for young children that is just so incredible to observe when we get to. And Debbie, did you want to share your vision? Because I loved, yeah.
My idea was I remember picking up my 5-year-old and 3-year-old from the family provider, and she had in the backyard a bucket of water, and it was mud everywhere, and the laughing and fun and just lighthearted spirit of the children as I picked them up that day, even though they were super muddy, was just heartwarming and wonderful and exactly what I wanted. She was there with them in the activity, watching what they were doing and only adding in order to, build on what they were learning or give a new idea about play. But their joyful creation, the 4 of these little boys together, was just so wonderful to observe. And that for me was the best experience for them at that time in their life.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you. Okay, so fellow panelists, feel free to come off a video and we will officially introduce you. And Tasha, do you want to go first and share, your own vision for ideal learning environments?
Sure, absolutely. I just couldn't help but smile as Debbie described that. I think anytime any of us picture children playing and really having fun, enjoying themselves, you just can't help but have it bring a smile to your face. But I'll start off by introducing myself. I'm Tasha Blalock. I'm the Chief Learning and Evaluation Officer at Trust for Learning. And Trust is really investing in infusing ideal learning practices in the public sector. And my role at Trust, which I just started recently, and I'm so excited to join, I'm leading the Head Start strategy and also helping to evaluate our portfolio of investments. And I've spent time in my career in research and evaluation teams at University of Pennsylvania and Temple University in the greater Philadelphia area. And I also served for 10 years in Pennsylvania's quality rating improvement system, Keystone Stars. And I saw lots of my buddies from Keystone Stars on the chat. So it's great to see you all here. Another really honored part of my experience, my career journey, is that for the last 6 years, I was the Early Head Start grantee administrator at Maternity Care Coalition. So really, as I talked today, a lot of my comments will be informed by the experiences of running a high quality program for underinvested and under-resourced communities, which Early Head Start really epitomizes that. So when I think about ideal learning, something that comes through really clearly in the evidence brief that I can relate to is that ideal learning environments can really happen anywhere. One of my favorite experiences as an early Head Start administrator was getting a chance to step away from my desk and participate in a family socialization meeting. Twice a month, our program, just like early Head Start programs across the country that do home visiting, would gather all of the families together that participate in home visiting and give them an opportunity to just commune, right? To get together and be with other families and all of our advocates over a shared lunch. It was always a balanced and healthy meal, and the foods always reflected the flavors and the cultural backgrounds of the families that we served. There's also opportunity for parent education and discussion, and of course, social play experiences for children. The families that we served in our program are extremely diverse. Many of them were recent immigrants from Mexico, Central America. One of our programs served a large group of Burmese families. And the staff at our program really reflected those languages. Our staff spoke Spanish, they spoke Burmese, but even those that didn't speak the same language as an individual family in our program made them feel at ease in a safe, fun, relaxed environment. Our socializations took place in a variety of places, including a large room on site, which was set up like a traditional classroom environment, just to give the children an opportunity and exposure to that type of setting, what it would be like to be in a classroom, which many of them would be going to as they turn 3 years old. But my favorites were when we took those socialization meetings on the road, and we would go to places around the community. We used the library, local parks. We even used the sort of town square right next to the Norristown Courthouse, if any of your Pennsylvanians are familiar with the large setting there. And we came together, we communed as a group. And I just want to take you there for a minute. I want you to travel there with me in your imagination. It's a warm spring day in April. It happens to be the week of the young child. And although we get together twice a month for socialization, those ones tend to be extra special. And you are invited to come with your 2-year-old and your 6-month-old baby to a very fun-filled event. Getting out of the house with them can be a bit of an ordeal. But when you visit the Early Head Start program, you don't have to bring food, you don't have to bring snacks. You don't even have to bring diapers and wipes. We have them for you. In fact, pack light, because you may even receive donated books or extra diapers or other essentials that you can take back home with you. You also know that when you arrive, there's going to be wonderful Early Head Start staff members who will be excited to see you and your children, and there will be many hands to hold the baby and fun activities for the bigger kids. And the fun is taking place in a park that you're familiar with. It's in the neighborhood. It's right near the zoo. You know where that is. You'll go there later with your children in the week. The program receives special permission to have it, and we've got music blasting, and there's fun stations for learning and play all over the place. When you arrive, you see some parents there that you've met at past events. And you even see a mom that you ran into at the supermarket that had a baby the same age as yours. You're so excited that she was able to get enrolled in the program. As you make your way over to her, lots of Early Head Start team members wave or come over to greet you as you and the kids as you join the group. And you go over and you sit on a blanket where story time's taking place in English and Spanish. After about 5 minutes, your 2-year-old jumps up and starts doing a little dance, a little twirl. And one of the Early Head Start advocates sees her and invites her to join the dancing nearby. She's shy, but she sees her mom and the advocate talking to each other in Spanish. And then that friendly lady also smiles right at her and invites her using words in Spanish and English, inviting her to come and play. So I hope you're there. I hope you feel the sunshine. I hope you hear the music. And, to me, that really epitomizes ideal learning. Some of my Pennsylvania colleagues might actually be a little surprised that I didn't select a traditional classroom environment, especially knowing that I spent lots of time literally in hundreds of classrooms during my time as an assessor. I've had the privilege to see lots of extremely wonderful learning environments where children experience personalized developmental learning tailored to their needs. And there's lots of high quality programs to choose from. But this particular scenario became my choice because of the unique ways that Head Start programs get to engage parents as a part of the performance standards expectations. And how my staff, at the time, they really took extra lengths to make these meaningful in our specific community. The program was delivered by a group of women of diverse cultures, languages, and backgrounds, and the families that we served were even more diverse in their backgrounds, languages, and cultures. And we paid close attention to making equity and belonging a core value. So that's why I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I see so much that's reflected in the evidence brief that really shows how programs can embrace that and have equity be a part of every moment of their program. So that is, my vision, and I will turn it over to Liz.
Tasha, that was beautiful. Can we just stay there for a while? That was fantastic. Gosh. So I guess I should introduce myself first. Liz Bruno, I'm president of the Brady Education Foundation. Our mission is to close the educational opportunity gaps associated with race, ethnicity, and family income. We do that by funding research that's going to inform philanthropy, that will be informed by and inform practice, and hopefully the real, the nugget that we're looking for, the gold ring for us is influencing policy and changing some of these policies that are making it really hard to provide the kind of programs that we're talking about today. Oh gosh, that was just so fantastic. I just started thinking about so many experiences. When you asked me to bring to life an ideal learning environment, I think about my own experiences. When I was a kid in Montessori, I remember my teacher bringing down the square for me to learn how to tie bows, and me having that sense of agency and mastery of how now I can tie my own shoes, and just how inviting it was for me to just be able to explore and use that natural curiosity, foster that intrinsic motivation. But we're talking about evidence. We're talking about, what's the research showing? I'm a developmental psychologist. I was at UNC Chapel Hill for 20 years before being part of the foundation. And I will say that when I think about ideal learning environments and what do we mean by high quality, I think the field has been making a mistake about talking about what is high quality, as if it's this one objective thing that's universally defined for everyone. It really is going to encompass, yes, there are some universal things. We are all human beings. When you talk about that neural development, Ellen, that you referenced in the beginning, those synapses that are happening, they're happening for all of our kids, right? And we want to be promoting that, wanting to experience and have that sense of agency that I had when I was able to learn how to tie my shoes on that board. That natural curiosity that was fostered in me. There are universals, but then there are also things that are culturally specific. And beyond that, that are racially, specifically, or ethnically, or due to the challenges of living in poverty, and or that are going to be specific. And so we need to be, when we think about high quality, in my mind, we're also thinking about what are the challenges and what are the traumas that have been historically and currently experienced by different marginalized groups, their socio-historical histories that they're bringing, and how is that environment, so high quality for those children is going to be different, what they need to address those. At the same time, the cultural wealth, all of these strengths that are promoted in communities, a high quality learning environment is going to be able to build upon those. I often say we want all of our children to read, like that's a goal, we want to get there, but all the different strengths that the kids are bringing because of their culture, because of the families and all of those things that they're bringing to the programs, they're coming in with different strengths that we can be building on. So yeah, my children, from 6 months, they were sitting on my lap and they were learning conventions of print. Other children got so much more wordplay in their early learning environments than I was able to do, so much more storytelling, so much more oral skills that it wasn't even part of what I was thinking about. But those children are coming in with those strengths. So my children came in with strengths to build on. Other children are coming in with other strengths to build on, for them all to eventually get to the place of reading, right? So we know that sensitive, nurturing environments, caregivers, that's promotive for and supportive of child development. But how that's going to be expressed, what we're going to see, can vary a lot by cultural community. And so high quality environment is going to be encompassing all of that. And I think that the field is getting a lot better at recognizing that there isn't this objective high quality. And there's a lot of really good research, I think, especially when we're thinking about the challenges and the traumas that are associated with systemic inequities and racism. We're getting better at that. For me, and I think the evidence document did such a great job of documenting all these things that we do know that are reflected in the ideal learning principles. I think where we need to go more is how are we building on strengths? What are these different strengths that children are bringing to the environment? And how can we be creating that high quality environment for all children so that they can reach their highest potential? Okay, I think I'm going to turn it to my friend Fabienne now.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with you. I'm Fabienne Doucet. I am at NYU, an associate professor of early childhood and urban education, and also the executive director of the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. Quite a mouthful, but I've been in this position since January, so I'm still learning the ropes, but really enjoying it. So an ideal learning environment, I don't know, Ellen, if you are able to pull up the slide that I sent of this. So these are some of my favorite images that I sort of use to ground myself when I think about, like, why am I here again? Why am I up till 2 a.m? working on this? Like, this is what grounds me and reminds me that for me, an early learning, an ideal environment is one in which each and every one of these children and the communities and the families that they represent feel seen and valued and has agency and is just welcome and feels warm and is excited and feels like there's, you know, possibilities for the future. Just spaces that that embody what I, based on research that I conducted at a Head Start that sits on the border of Brooklyn and Queens, what I came to recognize is like an ethos of respect is all I could, that was the best language that I could come up with when I was in you know, kind of living in the world of these Head Start families and providers and the teachers, the entire community. Folks who are familiar with Head Start know what I'm talking about. It's like a big family, and just being in that family over the course of a year was so special, and it was really that there was a sense that, like, everyone respects everyone, from the, regardless of what position you're in, from the oldest to the youngest. There was this sense, very deep sense of everybody here is valuable, everybody here matters and is important. And to me, that really comes sort of like at the front of the line when it comes to thinking about ideal learning environments. I mean, I think that both Liz and Tasha did such an amazing job of describing all of these other dimensions that I completely agree with. And I'm so glad that we are having this conversation, and that the Trust for Learning has put together these principles that are so helpful for us in helping us move forward. So I won't repeat these things, and so I just kind of adding that other, you know, another lens, another experience that I had. And just recognizing that I think we're all really deeply committed to quality. We're really deeply committed to seeing children being able to thrive, regardless of you know, who they come from, where they are, you know, all those kinds of things. That every single person is equally deserving of that respect. Equally, every person is equally deserving of agency and of opportunity and life chances. So those are the things that get me excited, and also that ground me and keep me committed, keep me tied in, and keep me up at 2 a.m.
Thank you, each of you. I'm like so much more inspired right now, even than I was when we started. Thank you for painting this vision. So I only prepared 2 questions for you all, and I'm really excited to like dig in on some of this. And then I know we're going to have lots of questions from folks who are out in the virtual world. So the first question, you know, I think about my own experience teaching, and I had this sort of like ideal teacher Ellen, like I had this idealized teacher version of myself. And depending on the day, you know, Monday maybe I was like 60% of the way there. Tuesday, maybe 90%. Wednesday, have a bad day, something goes wrong and I'm like plummeting. And so, the principles of ideal learning environments, they are like North Stars, right? They're ideals that we're aiming for. All of us are showing up with, the things that we're working on any given day. And I think too, the other kind of perspective that I take a lot is it feels like a really long way to go from like here to there. And I think, well, barely more than 100 years ago, like women didn't have the right to vote in this country. Civil rights legislation is barely half a century old. Gay marriage was not legal when I was born. So it's exciting, right? It's like we could be the generation who really helps move the needle on this. And I want to hear from each of you, and feel free to just jump in, whoever wants to go first. What do you think it's going to take to get there? You can go philosophical, you can go brass tacks. Where do we have momentum right now? And where do we have really big challenges? So really big question, but curious what you're each thinking.
Well, Ellen, I was really inspired that when you look through the evidence brief, it's so centered on equity that it talks about equity within each of the principles. And, I think there's a lot of momentum around that. Trust for Learning, I know, has been focused on that for a very long time, but unfortunately, the sad events of 2020 have brought even more people to the table to be thinking about equity. So there has been some momentum there. And, we're 2 years in, and I do worry about the momentum pausing a bit. But, I really hope that we can take advantage of this moment and continue to think about how we can continue to build on equity. It's important to have representative voices at the table for decision making. I work with a tremendous amount of, just wonderful colleagues across, so many different systems. And I really appreciate that often, the white colleagues that I work with are humongous, tremendous allies. And, but also know that that's not enough. We really have to have them be there at the table along with people who represent the communities that are being served at the table. I'll give you an example. I've had dear friends of mine who were allies who have said something that, they weren't sure of, or they felt uncomfortable, or maybe they just made a complete blip. They said something that was a little, off track on, on our equity goals. And having other people that you trust around the table, but who also know and have had experiences that can represent the communities that are being served is super important. So that combination of allyship in early childhood education leadership and diverse representation, I think, is such an important goal for us all.
So this question takes me in a few different directions. But and I was reflecting on it, one of the first things that came to mind, Ellen, was using the term of Lilia Bartolome is teacher political clarity. And I think that can be applied to all of our roles. But the idea of political clarity around understanding power and privilege and structural inequality, and how the systems and structures and the literally the water that we all live in, swim in, drink, all of it, have been set up to disadvantage some folks and put other folks at an advantage. Being extraordinarily crystal clear about that and about our intention to work against that daily, consistently, relentlessly, to me is how we're going to get there. And it might sound like you're talking about, like, we talk about brass tacks, it might sound like, something that's way too far up here, but I think that it is really important work, because we are so seeped in the traditional way of doing things, and our impulses, our gut reactions, our reflexes are just framed in these old models that we really need to shed. So it's really important for us to kind of always have that as front of mind. And I also think about how early childhood education has been used in really racist ways to justify harm of communities and of children. and to force groups to impacted groups to prove that they've been harmed. That early childhood education has been unresponsive to the concerns of communities, that it has centered deficit lenses, that like walking in the room, we're telling families and children that they're not ready, that they need this, and that they're not doing this at home, and that they haven't done enough of that. And so, but because we know that, and you know, these are things that have happened, and we know that they have happened. And because they've happened, we also can say that we can undo them, right? Like if early childhood education can be racist, it also stands to reason that we can make it anti-racist. And that's what I choose to like sit in and believe in, is like, we can make this different, and we can choose to be different. And we can be in early childhood education, the way that I define anti-racism is not like exclusive or, you know, comprehensive, but just for me, like being race and racism conscious. So not colorblind and not color mute and those kinds of things, but really kind of like recognizing that it's there, being strengths-based, humanizing, co-constructing with people, collaborative, centering people in community, like all of these things are toward anti-racist goals. And so while shifting mindsets, which is to me what this is all about, can feel like it's not really active, I think that another really important lesson that I learned from my colleague and former doctoral student, Sophia Bolt, who did some research on anti-racist efforts at an elite school, she was sort of recognizing and hearing a lot of people talk about urgency, like wanting to make changes like quickly, wanting to do things urgently. And so she dug into that a little bit more and found the work of Tema Okun, who talks about this sense of urgency actually being a characteristic of white supremacy culture. And I was just really like, it just really blew me away, and was, it's like it made sense to me. I was like, oh, right, like, because it's all about achievement, and it's all about kind of like being able to check off boxes and feel like we've done it. We now have 5 Black kids in the room. We now have 5 Latinx kids in a room. We have 14 South Asian kids, and boom, we've done it. We're like, let's go, go, go. Instead of, hold on a minute. Why do we need these different kids in the room? Like, why does it matter? Is the room ready? Am I ready? Like all of that kind of like mindset shifting is, I think, where we really need to focus. And I think that's where the momentum is, honestly. I also do think that that as a field, we are there. And so I just encourage us to kind of stay in that space and to not rush toward what's the checklist of things that I can do, and really more of like, how can we really continue to re-socialize ourselves and re-socialize one another within our field?
Fabian, you're bringing to my mind one of my favorite quotes, and it's by you, and I'm going to butcher it, but basically the point is being that how, you know, science as an endeavor has supported and has perpetuated all of this racism and the systems that we're talking about, and just as an endeavor has done that. And that's one of the things that really has to change, is that how we do our science, how we do it instead of 2 people, 4 people, with people, actually with community, and who's doing that work, and what are the questions that we're even asking, and why are we even asking them? I mean, so the science itself needs to change from being the racist that it has been to being the anti-racist way that it can be. You know, that includes, you know, how you conduct the research, but also who's conducting the research. Like, who's in power to ask those questions? Who's in power to actually conduct that research? So I think that's a big part of it in terms of how this is going to change. The science needs to change. And I agree with you that a lot of people are there, but we're also feeling a lot of the resistance, and a lot of the resistance from people who have intentions, that they feel like they have these great intentions, but they're also feeling really defensive and really scared. And, you know, so I think a lot of it was, we've got to sit down and be willing to have the hard conversations. We've got to be able to sit down and actually do that. And when you talked about that sense of urgency, I remember so being there, and I remember being like, okay, let's work really hard. And then realizing, okay, that's just part of my privilege to even think that, okay, let's just do this. But it's that kind of reflection, and that's that kind of thinking that we all need to be participating in, having the hard conversations, having the conversations and doing the science with communities, not being colorblind. You know, I literally had to have a conversation with somebody the other day saying, so you want to talk about race, but you don't want to talk about racism? Like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, it just doesn't even make sense. And, you know, the big picture, it's a public good. Like, we need to pay our professionals not just a living wage, a professional wage. We need to put more money into the system as a society, not put this back on the backs of the caregivers, on the parents, but recognize that this actually is a public good that is serving all of us, as well as our babies and our children. And so for me, like, it feels overwhelming. That's what it's going to take. Oh my gosh, how do we do this? But we know it. Like, so for me, I'm optimistic and I'm positive because at least we know what we need to do. The hard work is doing it. We've got to actually do it. But look at this great community of people who are coming together to say, yes, it's worth it to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning and actually get this work done.
You three are amazing. This is why I wanted to do this webinar, for my own personal benefit, to pick your brains and get to listen. Thank you. I have just one more question for the panel, and I see lots of comments and questions coming in the chat, so we'll get to those in just a minute. So thinking more on sort of a state systems level, maybe a QRIS level, and really building on the, you know, awareness right now, at least greater awareness, certainly among white people, about the importance of racial equity and the momentum that we do have. What's needed next at a state level, QRIS level? Where do we see that racial equity momentum heading next in terms of policy change, practice change, implementation change? Would love to hear what you all are thinking.
Well, you know, I guess I'll start with that. I served a long time, at the very beginning of Pennsylvania's QRIS. And it's such a moment of opportunity when QRISs are starting. And, you know, I hope there's some states who are on this call who are still in the midst of it. And like, I think one of the things to take as almost a warning is, you know, when you think of QRIS, you have to spend more time on the Q and the I, right? The quality and the improvement. And what I've seen a lot of people get caught up in is in the rating, right? Like, how do you measure what's happening? And it's sort of like what we talked about before. It's like almost a framework that, you know, the white framework that sometimes it's all about the measurement and how do we, you know, scale that out. And you can do that and miss opportunities to really build on quality that exists in a way that you're not thinking of. I've spent so much time in classrooms, and I saw a comment in the chat. I definitely want to be inclusive of definitely not just Head Start. There's so much quality, so many different quality environments. And one of my favorite opportunities, it's similar to Deb. It's, you know, going into family childcare providers' homes and seeing how they make quality real, right in the communities that they serve. And, you know, my job, the reason I was in 100 classrooms, you know, plus, is because I was there to do a rating. And often the rating that I was sitting there doing, you know, did not reflect the quality that I saw in front of me in Miss Joanna's program. And that was so frustrating because the community that was choosing to have their child in Miss Joanna's program knew that there was a reason for that. And you can really go down a wrong path if there's a huge disconnect between how Miss Joanna's rating is on that Keystone Stars or whatever quality rating scale you're using. If Miss Joanna is someone you know who is a prized, amazing provider, and she's a star level 1 or a star level 2, that can call in question what are we even measuring? So I think bringing together some of the true reflections of quality and having that reflected and really focusing on the quality and the improvement, because Miss Joanna, everybody needs improvement, but let's not let the rating get in the way of that. So that would just be, you know, what I would put out there as something to kind of watch out for and to be thoughtful about as we're developing systems and as we're taking a look at fully developed systems and how we can start to transform them.
I think you made such great points, Tasha. I think a lot of the problems so there was this great intent. We want high quality for all of our kids. This is what we want. And then there's the intent, and then actually what happens, right? And the actual impact of what's actually happened to our programs because of these systems. And I'm choosing my words on purpose. What has happened to our programs because of these? You know, we're using measures that really are not that very much predictive of child outcomes. You know, so you can have this star amazing teacher, and then and then you're looking at what's happening. And so this is going to veer off a little bit to your next webinar, so I'm not going to do that about measurement, but that's such a great brief that's put out, and I recommend everyone to that and the webinar, because it's just such a phenomenal piece of work. But my response is, it gets back to what I said in the beginning. There is no one objective high quality. Like, once you get past some of the basic health and safety standards, how children and caregivers are interacting, and all of those processes that are going on to develop agency, to develop executive function, to develop all of these things, and for kids to just be enjoying themselves and having a great time and experiencing a wonderful learning environment, that can be expressed in so many different ways. I actually think we need to turn things on its head a little bit. Instead of us coming in with our measures to every community in every place all the time and saying, this is the one measure, or the one of the, the three measures that are used over and over everywhere all the time. What if we actually turned it around and said, hey, here are all the possible measures, or here are all the possible sections within a measure. Now, what's appropriate for you? What's appropriate for your community? What is it in your program and your community that is important? Wow, okay, guess what? We have a measure for this, and we can help you. Oh, we don't have a measure for that. Okay, scientists, get ready and go develop that measure so that we have something for the programs themselves to pick and say, because I would bet, I haven't done this research, but I would bet that 99.99999% of caregivers want to be accountable, in the sense that they want to be providing an amazing high quality environment for our children, right? So what if we turned it around and we said, instead of us coming in and telling you, we're rating you, what if we in community together decided what is important for you? And then you get to pick how you're going to be holding yourselves accountable. You get to pick the data that's going to come down. I think that if we can make that mind shift, like actually change it that way, we would go so much farther in actually getting back to what that original intention was of these systems when they were being put in place. My 2 cents.
Yes, absolutely. And just, I mean, the two of you, it's like we are all sharing the same kind of mind space, because that is exactly where I was going in thinking about the importance of meaningfully engaging families and communities in figuring out these, systems and rating systems and defining quality. And so here I'm going to take the opportunity to promote the work of my amazing colleagues at the NYU Metro Center. So as I said, I just started in January, and you know how it is, you're starting somewhere new and you're just kind of trying to get to know people and starting to get to know things. And I was affiliated with Metro, but didn't really know like the deep inner workings. And I'm just like, every day I'm just like, I'm surrounded by these like dope, amazing, incredible people. And so among those amazing, dope, amazing people are the Education, Justice, Research and Organizing Collaborative. They're EJ-ROC. And they created these culturally responsive curriculum scorecards. I'm going to put the link in the chat to find the, just to learn more about the scorecards. So these scorecards were originally designed for K to 12th grade, ELA, and STEAM curricula. And they were designed as a tool to help parents, teachers, administrators, students, and community members determine the extent to which curricula are or are not culturally responsive, right? So that's sort of like the history and the kind of basic thing. But they have been adapted and used in so many different settings. And because they were developed collaboratively by parents, students, educators, and researchers, like literally sitting around tables and having conversations about the scorecards, I feel like they represent such a great model for how we could in early childhood could think about culturally responsive and sustaining and equity as like these like North Stars, like these goals that we want to have. And then how could we imagine embedding culturally responsive and sustaining practice, humanizing practice, anti-racist practice, all these ideals, how could we consider embedding those within our quality rating and improvement systems? How could we design, CRSC scorecards that would be used to assess current quality rating systems, right? We could use them in so many different ways, but just like really being creative, but really being collaborative, and again, starting with the communities and the families and saying, and the practitioners, and saying, like, what is it that is, what do you see that's working? What do you see that's good? What, starting from those places of strength and then building from there, and then kind of holding these things next to each other and saying, okay, and also the research suggests that this might be something to think about. What would this look like for, in your space? So really that coming together and working together is, I really think, like where we need to be heading, and where I think if we're serious about centering equity, if we're really serious about doing this kind of work, like that's where we have to be, right? Because working in our little silos and working and then coming in from the top down and judging people and telling them you're doing everything wrong, like that hasn't been working. It's not working for anybody. Nobody's happy, right? And teachers are not happy. They're depressed. They feel like everybody's crapping on them. We're miserable. We feel like, it's just like, no, it's not working for anyone. If it's not working, move on, right? Let's start over and do and participate in practices that our communities that have been around for centuries and ages have been doing. Let's go back to those things that we know are ways of like really kind of humanizing and nurturing and working together.
So I'm going to pivot us into the amazing questions that we're getting from folks out in our virtual room. And I would love to start with one that potentially builds on exactly what you were just saying. We've got a question here. How can we work toward our ideals for children without putting more burden on early childhood educators who themselves could be considered an oppressed group? So this is like the crux, right? So going right to the crux, I will just note briefly, and then I'd love to hand it back off to you all. So Trust for Learning. So we work with these Ideal Learning partners, part of the Ideal Learning Roundtable, and they're a mix of different kinds of organizations. Some are comprehensive early childhood programs like an EduCare or Montessori or a Waldorf or Tools of the Mind. Others are experts in particular areas of work, like a Children's Equity Project. But for the ones that are more comprehensive approaches, we worked with them in 2020 to peel back the curtain on the educator development side of their work and really try to see, well, how are each of these approaches supporting adult development? And, the underlying message, of course, is compensation. Like that is the structural message. And we wanted to look at what are these practices to really support an adult to develop those sensitive, nurturing, responsive skills in coherence with the child's experience. And so I think, of course, compensation, like this is the message that we have to keep shouting from the rooftops in unison over and over again, until we get the milestones that are going to be needed. And on the more kind of tactical side, how are we supporting adults who are in the field right now? So I'll just plug that Pathways report. And I know we've got colleagues of mine I think Chrisanne just put it in there. I'll preview also that this is something that we're going to come back to in next week's webinar around measurement. And that the measurement brief does start to address, right? But panelists, I will turn it back over to you in terms of, the crux of this challenge. How are we, and this is what I just think is so ironic and frustrating about the way that we're currently set up, is that children and adults are like at odds structurally in our current system. And we know that that does not have to be the way that it is. So yeah, I'd love to hear what your current thinking is on this huge challenge.
I think it does sort of build from what I was referring to in being collaborative and recognizing that a lot of the way that I think education policy is approached is to just put burden on teachers, is to say, like, now if only teachers would do these 12 things, well, these teachers are not doing these 14 things, and that's why children are failing. That's why our society is going, it's that whole idea of blaming. And of course, if we want to get real deep about it, we know that most teachers are women, right? And here we are in this big old patriarchy, and we have tons of, especially early childhood providers, who don't have advanced degrees, who are women of color, people who are not necessarily recognized in the formal childcare system, right? Folks who are babysitting kids in their basements. These are women of color, these are nannies and so forth. Like, we know why, right? Like, we know why the burden is being placed on us. So what we have to do then is just resist it and say, like, we refuse it. We're not going to have that. We're not going to allow it. We're going to hold everyone accountable. We know that people, like, you know, we're talking about specifically like educators, they want to be held accountable. They, you know, Miss Joanna knows that she's not perfect, and she's happy to have somebody come in and sit down with her and say, hey, have you thought about this? Right. And so being able to sort of like provide that kind of support and saying, we see you, we need to provide mental health services, of course, compensation, but being able to recognize like how taxing the work is, especially I'm thinking specifically like in these COVID times and in the past couple of years, the trauma and just emotional distress that people have been in as a society, but early childhood educators, just because of the very important role that they play in community systems, do you know what I mean? Like, they are often like a first place of like feeling all the pain points, right? They're feeling all the things that the parents are feeling. They're feeling all the things that the children are feeling. It's such a hard place to be. And so I think really kind of emphasizing the importance of recognizing the mental health needs and how we need to support teachers, educators in particular, and then also saying, and we want to hold leaders accountable, and we want to hold, you know, researchers accountable. Like, everyone needs to participate, as opposed to thinking that we're going to be able to like look to one group or fix one thing and everything's going to get better. It didn't take one person or even one sector to mess everything up. We all participated. We all had our hands. We were all elbows deep. So then we got to get elbows deep in helping to fix it too.
That is so true, Fabienne. And, you know, there's not a whole lot to add to that. Like, I think you said it so well. And, but I just have to repeat compensation, because it has to start there. You know, I think we need to honor our workforce and recognize our workforce. A lot of times I see, you know, we build these systems around this idealized person who you think is going to be the teacher, who is someone who just graduated with an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree in early childhood education. And guess not what? That is not who is teaching in a lot of early childhood education classrooms. So what if we just accepted that as real and flipped our, you know, our system to really serve and build on the amazing women who do come to the table as early childhood education providers. You know, those women who love children and said, oh, well, what can I do? Like, what kind of work can I do to, you know, support my love of children? And they end up in the classroom. That is a great start, right? Someone who loves and honors children is a great person to invest in. And instead of assuming that, you know, we have to wait until these 20-year-olds come out of college with their associates and they're not coming, let's invest in the women that we have. And you see what happens when we don't invest in them. You know, COVID took them right out. You know, there's so many options out there. There are so many other things for people to do. And unfortunately, we're now suffering as a whole industry in those people walking away. So what if we walk toward them and really did something to invest in? Yes, we want our children to meet the highest excellence in their, you know, in their developmental goals, but the people that are teaching them can absolutely do that.
I'm going to be very quick on this because these two women are amazing, and all I can do is bold and underline and italics everything that they just said. And, you know, it really can be summarized. We focused so long on the program and the teacher and these kids are not having great outcomes. So now let's fix these kids and let's, you know, have this program. And everything that we're talking about is, you know, raising it up to the systemic level, like really all these factors that are going on and impacting this. And the fact that we've starved our system, we've completely starved our system, putting it back on the backs of the teachers, putting it on the backs of the parents. It's not going to work. It just doesn't work. It's a failed market model. We know this. And optimistic me says, we know it now. Okay, we operated for so long in that old way of saying, okay, let's fix the families and let's fix the teachers and let's fix the programs. Like, we actually can recognize this now, and we're having amazing conversations like this. So optimistic me says that we are on that road to doing that, because now our focus is in the right place. And we got to get back to thinking about what we actually value. You know, we talk about all these things. It kind of gets back again to the other question a little bit, but we've talked about, you know, when we're rating teachers, and I was for 1 year, I did it in between undergrad and grad. And I will say it was the hardest job of my entire life. Okay, absolutely. And, you know, anybody who does this work, I think, needs to have this experience, but maybe they're not all really good with children. So maybe that's not a good idea. But it's just like everybody needs to work for tips once in their life, at least. So, but when you think about what these women have been bringing, and it's mostly women, but there's some men, so I should be inclusive. Think about all the culturally sustaining ways of being that they have been bringing to children now for generations that we've been ignoring. We haven't been valuing. We haven't been paying attention to that. So let's get back to what we really need to be valuing here. Let's actually get back to thinking about all the systems that we've been talking about, but not keep talking about it at the abstract level. Get very concrete about, so this funding mechanism, the way this is set up, is what has starved our system. So now let's talk about concrete, real actions that we can take to move beyond that. And then, you know, we know our problem, so now let's fix it.
So we have a bunch of questions, and I know we're not going to get to all of them. And I wonder if we could do a 1-2 with 2 last questions real quick. So let's see if we can fit them in. Fabienne, if you want to take this one and you have a brief example of culturally sustaining practice. I know that is a huge part of your work. So do you mind sharing like a quick snapshot of what that actually, what does that mean? What does that look like?
So quick first example that comes to mind is being is allowing children's languages, the many languages that they live in and you know, work in and that are part of their lives, to be in classrooms comfortably. There's a classroom that I observed in the city where children were speaking in multiple Englishes, in multiple Spanishes, in Creoles, and all of it was welcome and was just part of the classroom life. And the teacher who actually spoke an Asian language was also using her words sometimes to connect to the words that the children were using. And I think that's just a super simple, short example of culturally sustaining means we're not forcing everybody to be the same. Even though we might have a shared language, and that shared language is English in this classroom, and that's cool. That doesn't mean that the other languages aren't welcome. It doesn't mean that they're not valued. It doesn't mean that there's no place for them. In fact, it means that there is a place for them because it's our bridge that helps us to get there.
Thank you. And Tasha, if you want to take one last one quickly, we did have a follow-up about how QRIS systems can evolve to be more supportive of quality. So if you have a brief response on that, we can head into some resources that we want to share with folks and next steps after that.
Absolutely. You know, I think sometimes it's the simplest things that you can do to really inform a system in a new way. And one of the epiphanies for me in, you know, coming out of the QRIS system in Pennsylvania directly into, which was the hardest thing, like talking about quality forever and then having the responsibility of administrating a high quality program. That wasn't easy. It's a lot easier to talk about it than to do it. And one of the things that informed my journey the most of all is the responsibility that Head Start programs put on family engagement and leadership. We had a policy council that really did its job, like held me in check, held everybody in check, you know, reviewed every budget, was involved in every decision. And when you do that authentically, you come out with a very different program. And I think that if QRIS systems can adopt some of that approach where you really listen to the people who are the customers really, you know, and who represent the communities that you serve, have them at the table, that can make some humongous transformations.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to share my screen again. And we've got a few resources that we want to share. Lots of great questions are still coming in the chat. So I'm sorry that we will not get to all of them live. Let me just get this set up correctly here. We'll put these in the chat as well. And we won't talk through each of them, but a link to the evidence brief, Fabienne's work at NYU Metro Center. And I will just give you a shout out specifically. When we were developing this evidence brief, we'll have to figure out who we cited the most, but you would be up there with the people that we cited the most because your research is so powerful, beautiful, compelling, so important. So thank you for doing the work that you're doing. So please learn more about her work. Build has a great list of resources around equitable early childhood systems. Want to make sure everybody's aware of that. And then Liz, in collaboration with another one of our board members, Ioma Iruka, they co-published this op-ed about needing a proactively anti-racist scientific method based on work that they do in their academic lives. So please check those things out. And I'm going to hand back over to Debbie in just a second. I want to say a huge thank you to Jonathan behind the scenes, to Debbie for hosting this. And we're not done. Part 2 is next week. We're going to have different panelists. My colleague, Chris Ann, has been working on this second webinar, and it's all about more brass tacks. If we have this vision, how do we measure it, right? We started touching on today, but hope to see everybody back here next Thursday. And Debbie, I will hand over to you and say thank you so much.
Well, I'd just like to thank our panel so much. And I'd like folks that are still on the line to leave a word in the chat box about how you're feeling after this very inspiring conversation today. Thanks again to you all. It's just been wonderful here. And I can't wait for the second part of this series next week. So thank you, everyone. Goodbye.